From George Ivanovich Gurdjieff's All and Everything, Chapter 40. Reading 3. Beelzebub tells how people learned and again forgot about the fundamental cosmic law of Heptaparaparshinokh. I already said that in the beginning, while that totality of true information, or that fragment of genuine knowledge, was handed down from the beings of one generation to the beings of subsequent generations only through the genuine initiates there, it not only underwent a change in the entirety of the exact sense put into it, but it even began, thanks to other also genuine learned beings among their followers of subsequent generations, to be detailized and become accessible then to the perception of even ordinary three-brained terrestrial beings. Among these followers, a century and a half after the sacred Rosguarno of the saints, brothers, there was a certain genuine learned being, King Tutos by name, who, on the basis of the principles of the construction of the middle part of the apparatus a la Atpan, named Zendvok, propounded a very detailed theory under the name Evolution and Involution of Vibrations. And for the confirmation of this theory of his, he made a special elucidatory apparatus, which he called Law of Machovina, and which, by the way, later became also widely known among almost all the learned beings of our great megalocosmos. The said apparatus, Law of Machovina, like the middle part of the Ala Atpan, consisted of a very strong frame with a great many strings stretched on it, made from the intestines and tail hairs of various quadruped beings there. One end of each string was fixed to one edge of this frame, and the other to pegs inserted into another edge. These pegs were inserted in such a way that they could be freely turned in their what are called peg holes, and the strings fixed onto them could at will be tightened or loosened, as much as was necessary for the required number of vibrations. Of the great number of strings stretched on the Law of Machovina, 49 were colored white, and the totality of vibrations, that is to say, the definite sound obtained from the vibrations of each one of them, was called a whole, center of gravity of the octave, which definite sound corresponded to that which your favorites now call a whole note. Each 7 strings of these gravity center sounds, or whole notes, were then and are still called an octave. In this way, there were stretched on the apparatus Law of Machovina 7 octaves of whole notes, the totality of the general consonants of which gave what is called the sacred Anziano. That is, just what the 2 great brothers suspected, and which happened almost exactly to coincide with what, as I already said, they then named Neronosian world sound. Each such an octave of strings on the Law of Machovina gave that totality of vibrations which, according to the calculations of the great twin brothers, correspond to the totality of the vibrations of all those cosmic substances which, issuing from 7 separate independent sources, compose one of the 7 centers of gravity of the fundamental common cosmic Osnapolian octave. Each white string on the Law of Machovina was tuned separately by this Chinese learned being, King Tutos, in such a way that it gave that average number of vibrations, which, according to the calculations of the great brothers, ought also to be in substances, which are one of the 7 centers of gravity of the given whole totality of substances, which in its turn is one of the 7 centers of gravity of the fundamental cosmic octave of substances. On the Law of Machovina, each octave, as well as each whole note of the octave, had names of their own, and namely the highest octave of the strings was called Arachialponish, the second highest Erkrodiapon, the third highest Erodiapon, the fourth highest Korordiapon, the 5th highest Piongiapon, the 6th highest Vetserordiapon, the seventh highest, octeror diapon. And the gravity center strings themselves were painted white and were called the same in all octaves, but with the addition of the name of the given octave itself. And namely, these whole notes were called thus: the first highest, adashtanas; the second highest, evotanas; the third highest, gavortanas; the fourth highest, maikitanas; the fifth highest, maidotanas; the sixth highest, lukotanas; the seventh highest, sonitanas. The contemporary beings of the earth now call these same whole notes do, si, la, sol, fa, mi, re. By the way, my boy, in order that the greatness of these two saints, brothers, should be still more evident to you, I draw your attention to the fact that the calculations made by them and the qualitativeness established by these calculations of what is called the vivifyingness of the vibrations of sound, which corresponded, according to their suppositions, with the vivifyingness of cosmic sources of substances, appeared to coincide almost exactly with reality. This merit of theirs was all the greater because, as terrestrial beings, they had no true information about this and were able to make their correct suppositions and almost accurate calculations of many objective cosmic truths exclusively only thanks to their own conscious labors and intentional sufferings. Further on, this Lav Mersnokh, in each octave, between these white strings or whole notes, this learned being, King Tutos, strung in certain places 5 further strings, but this time painted black. These black strings, however, he named Demisak Saksa, which, according to the terminology of the beings of the earth, corresponded to what they call half notes. And these half note strings on the Lav Mersnokh were not strung between those whole notes, between which, according to the indications of the saints Chunkiltez and Chuntropel, there is, according to the sacred Heptaparaparshinokh, no possibility of the independence of the evolution and involution of the vibrations of sound. And these places they were the first to call gaps. And in the given places of the octave where these gaps ought to be, this learned being, King Tutos, strung special strings between the whole notes, made of the tail hairs of beings, called their horse. These hair strings gave vibrations which were not always the same, and King Tutos named these vibrations chaotic. The number of the vibrations obtained from these hair strings depended not on the stretching of them, as in the case of other strings, but on other causes, chiefly on 3 causes ensuing from surrounding cosmic results, namely, on the action of the vibrations dispersed around them obtained from other strings of the Lav Mersnokh, on the state of what is called the temperature of the atmosphere at the given moment, and on the radiations of the beings present nearby without distinction of brain system. On this Lav Mersnokh, between these white, black, and hair strings, there were also strung in each octave 14 strings also from twisted intestines, which were painted red and called Kisu Kestur. And if contemporary beings of the earth were to use these strings, they would call them quarter notes. In addition to this, all those quarter note strings, which were stretched on either side of the hair strings, were fitted in such a way that the vibrations issuing from them could at any moment be changed as desired by means of tightening or loosening these strings, and thus the vibrations they produced could be regulated and by ear blended with the frequently changing vibrations obtained from the hair strings. And this was so done because, thanks to the frequently changing vibrations of the hair strings, the qualitativeness of which, I already said, depended on the temperature of the atmosphere, on the radiations of the beings present nearby, and on many other causes, The vibrations of these red strings acquired such a property that if they did not blend with the vibrations of the hair strings, the vibrations issuing from them would act on the beings present very cacophonically, harmfully, even to their possible total destruction. With the frequent changing, however, of the stretching of the red strings, and with the blending of their vibrations with the general vibrations issuing from the law of Machovina, their harmlessness was obtained. That is to say, owing to this, the general vibrations issuing from the law of Machovina became for the beings who heard them what is called harmoniously flowing and not harmfully acting. And so, my boy, this apparatus, law of Machovina, and also the detailed theory of this ancient, conscientious, learned being, King Tutos, suffered the same fate as the incomparable apparatus Alla Atapan, and the whole totality of true information cognized by the brothers. Owing to the continuing and even increasing formation in the sense of quantity of certain of your favorites of the mentioned new type, with the said inherency of cunning wiseacring, all this totality of information was from that time on altered, and its genuine sense and significance gradually forgotten. And as regards how the basic principle of the arrangement of the strings of the apparatus law of Machovina, and also that part of the Alla Atapan, the Zendavok, automatically reached to your contemporary favorites, this proceeded owing to the following reasons. When the acuteness of the mentioned confused period had passed, and when certain of the surviving fragments from all these great attainments of reason of the still relatively normal three-brained beings of your planet again began to be transmitted to subsequent generations in that way which before this had already been well established in the process of their ordinary existence, that is to say, the way of transmission only through beings who had already merited to become and to acquire the knowledge of genuine initiates, and when each year from among these latter more and more responsible beings were formed with the inherency just mentioned, then at this same period of time a three-brained being, also a scientist of new formation, who arose in this same China under the name of Chayu, was formed into a responsible being and became the cause of the knowledge and practical adoption of this seven-toned scale of sound, becoming generally accessible and being transmitted from generation to generation. It automatically reached also to your contemporary favorites. In the early years of his responsible existence, this Chayu was destined, thanks to certain of his corresponding subjective merits, for a candidate of what is called first degree of initiate, and in consequence help was given him without his knowledge, as it had long before been established by custom, by the genuine initiated beings there who had to do so to obtain every kind of information relating to various true events which took place on their planet in the past. And as my latest detailed investigations elucidated to me, he became worthy, among other things, to be also informed about the great apparatus law of Machovina in all details of its construction. And then, only in order that similar beings around him should regard him as a scientist, this Chayu, being one of the first, so to say, ideally formed scientists of new formation, there, that is, a being with a completely formed inherency to wiseacre, not only wiseacred a new theory of his own on the basis of this information learned by him in the said manner concerning the details of the great apparatus law of Machovina, affirming and denying, so to say, absolutely nothing relating to the laws of vibration, but he also constructed his new simplified sound-producing instrument named King. His simplification consisted in this, that without having at all taken into consideration the red and hair strings on the law of Machovina, he made the basis of his sound-producing instrument only the white and black strings, and moreover only the number of strings of 2 octaves, and he placed them thus, that one whole octave, which was found in the middle, had for its evolutionary and involutionary continuation half an octave from its next higher octave, and half an octave from its proceeding lower octave. And so, although the theory wiseacred by this Chayu also did not last very long, yet nevertheless this sound-producing instrument, king, constructed by him, had become generally accessible owing to its simplicity, and in consequence of the fact that the result obtained from it during intentional action turned out to be very good and satisfactory for, so to say, the tickling of many data crystallized in their common presences, thanks to the consequences of the properties of the organ Kundabuffer, it began to pass automatically down from generation to generation. Although the outer form of this sound-producing instrument, together with the construction of its frame, the stretch of the strings, and their names were changed many times by the beings of subsequent generations, having been ultimately formed among your contemporary favorites into their heavy sound-producing instruments, complicated to the degree of idiocy, and in their power incommensurably degenerated to a childish degree, such as clavicymbals, clavichord, organ, grand piano, upright piano, harmonium, and so on. Yet the basic principle of what is called the alternation of gravity center sounds has remained at the present time such as were actualized by the saints, brothers, Chun Kiltez and Chun Tropel, on the Zendvok, that is, the middle independent part created by them of the incomparable experimental apparatus al-Atapan. That is why, my boy, this, as it is now called there, Chinese seven-toned subdivision of the octave of sound, simplified by the mentioned Chayu, which has reached down to your contemporary favorites, and which is used at the present time by them for all their sound-producing instruments, enumerated by me, might still, as I have already said, partly serve for, so to say, the practical, confrontative study and approximate cognizance of how in the process of the most great trago auto-ecocrat, from what is called the flowing of some vibrations from others, cosmic substances arise of different density and vivifyingness, and in which way, uniting and disuniting among themselves, they form large and small, relatively independent concentrations, and thus actualize the common cosmic Irani-Ranumanj. Moreover, you will soon clearly convince yourself about this when, on returning to our dear Caritas, I will show you, as I have already promised, and explain practically the significance of the tuning on that contemporary sound-producing instrument, the piano, which was taken by me among a number of other things from the surface of your planet, and which I brought in order experimentally to elucidate to myself, on being free at home, one of its particularities which I did not have sufficient time to elucidate there on the spot, and which is connected with the strange psyche of these three-brained beings who have taken your fancy, and with the vibrations of different vivifyingness engendered around them. And if besides this I now still add, concerning the strange psyche of your favorites, what I constated during my last sojourn among them, namely, that none of the contemporary three-brained beings of your planet, in spite of the fact that they, having put this same Chinese seven-tone subdivision as the basis of all their sound-producing instruments, almost daily perceive the results of its consequences, are not only not at all inspired by this, as they should be objectively, but on the contrary, under the action of this kind of consonance, with the total absence of remorse, and even with the impulse of satisfaction, intentionally maintain in themselves the flowing of those associations of all their spiritualized parts, which arise in their common presences under the influence of data crystallized in them from the consequences of the properties of the, for them, accursed organ Kundabuffer. Then you, I am sure, after such a practical demonstration on this piano, will have not only an approximate representation concerning all what are called some obtained from the other and harmoniously flowing gravity center vibrations, but likewise you will constate once more with the impulse of astonishment to what an extent there is weakened in the common presences of these favorites of yours the essence of the action of those being data, which in general are proper to be crystallized in the presences of all three-brained beings, and the totality of which is called quickness of instinct. And so, my boy, thanks on the one hand to the infallibly continuing deterioration in the common presences of these three-brained beings who have taken your fancy, of the quality of the functioning of the data crystallized in them for healthy being mentation, and on the other hand to the always increasing number among them being formed into responsible beings of the mentioned new types, namely, of learned beings of new formation, there ultimately reached the contemporary three-brained beings of this ill-fated planet from this detailed totality of information, already thoroughly cognized by the reason of former beings similar to them, and almost unprecedented everywhere in the universe among ordinary three-brained beings, and which had gradually begun to change, namely, the totality of that true information which today is already used for the welfare of ordinary three-brained beings everywhere on the planets of our great megalocosmos, with the exception of the beings of only that planet on which this totality of information arose, only that which our always esteemed Mullah Nasser ad-Din defines by the following words: Glory to thee, Lord Creator, for having made the teeth of wolves, not like the horns of my dear buffalo, for now I can make several excellent combs for my dear wife. And with particular regard to the Chinese seven-tone subdivision of the octave, which has reached down to your contemporary favorites, then, although, as I have already said, they use it widely in the process of their ordinary existence, yet at the same time they do not even suspect that such a subdivision was specially created and constructed on those sound principles on which everything existing on the whole of our great megalocosmos is maintained.